Welcome to the ProLife Team podcast. I'm Jacob Barr, and I'm here with Dr. Joe Malone. And today, we're going to be talking about the history of sex education and talking about where we would like to see it continue towards, which is a healthier sexual integrity education viewpoint. So, Dr. Joe, I'm excited to have you on the ProLife Team podcast once again. For those who don't know you as of yet, would you introduce yourself as if you were speaking to a group of pregnancy clinic directors?
I would be glad to, Jacob, and thanks for having me again. I've come to the pregnancy care center movement, I guess, in just the last couple of years, and it's been a pleasure and an honor. I have a background with a PhD in health with a specialization in sexual wellness. So I'm really on the preventive side. I'm really on the side of educating young people, particularly young women, about the things that they can do to prevent even getting into the situation of having an unwanted pregnancy. So I work with a lot of pregnancy care centers, staffs, in helping to educate them on all the biological background to how heterosexuality works. So really glad to be able to provide that. And it's been something that God has blessed me with. I really feel is my mission in life.
Awesome. So tell us about the history, or go ahead and get the conversation started with what you want to talk about when it comes to the history of sex ed and your vision. Yeah, go ahead and get us started into this conversation.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, it's always a pleasure talking with you, Jacob. I always appreciate it. Sex ed really has come to be something that I think is negative in a lot of ways in our country and around the world, actually, because it's been used to sexualize, literally sexualize our young people for a purpose that most of us wouldn't agree with. There's a whole history to it that I'd like to get into. And are you ready for me to get into it at this point?
Yeah.
Okay. So
let's go for it.
Okay. Well, originally sex ed in the United States, starting, let's say in the early 1900s, it had a noble purpose to it. It was basically called hygiene. And, I'm old enough that I can even remember this approach when I was a young person. And what they did was teach the different things that the STI dangers and different things that you could get, problems that you get from being sexually active as a young person. They actually taught morals and that type of thing, and ethics, and the consequences, like I said, of pregnancy, of course, and all those STIs. So it was actually a good thing to begin with, but up to about 1960, it continued on that pattern. But around between the 50s and 60s, there was a change, and it started going in the direction of, I think, really promoting sexuality amongst the students. And the reason that happened, I believe, we have to kind of look outside the United States, and because around the rest of the world, and along with the progressive movement in the United States, which kind of started in the late 1800s and then was just getting started in the early 1900s, in the combination with these folks I'm going to mention, we've ended up in the place that we are today with comprehensive sexuality education that really is rather than a preventive, it's more of a promotive of casual sex. But before I get into the people in that line of the historical line, I should point out that the first modern sexual revolution, in the way that we think about it, happened in the Soviet Union when the Russian Revolution brought about the Soviet Union, and starting about 1918. And in the 1920s, basically, Soviet Union, at least the early to the mid 20s, they had all kinds of things that were, the first time in history. They had abortion for the first time in history. They had abolition of marriage, just civil partnerships. Nudity was practiced widely in the Soviet Union. You could get divorced just by making a statement that you were no longer married. There was a bunch of illegitimate babies being born. For instance, in Moscow, over half the babies in the early 1920s were in Moscow were being, illegitimately born. So, out of wedlock, I should say. So the interesting thing is they tried this really first modern sexual revolution in Soviet Union, the communist approach to things in the early 20s, and it lasted until about the mid 20s. And at that point, because of the problems that it caused, because of the way it was tearing up society, they started rolling it back. And by the early to mid 1930s, so lasted for maybe 10-ish to 15 years, everything was rolled back. Everything, all of the, I guess you say, liberalizing things that they had done. And so it ended up being a failed experiment. So that's something we need to keep in mind from the beginning. But some people around the rest of the world started taking up this idea and starting instituting in other countries. And the reason I'm laying this out is because it ended up in the United States eventually, and Western Europe. So a young man named at the time George Lukács, he was a Hungarian communist, and he was the commissar of culture for their country. The country didn't last very long, but he tried to institute sex ed there as a weapon. It was a cultural weapon to try to break down Judeo-Christian moral ethics and really marriage and the family. And all the people, men, I'm going to name off here, have that common. They all their goal was to break down the Judeo-Christian basis of society. So George Lukács, his program in Hungary it started in 1919, only lasted about a year to 2 years, because the Hungarian communist government got overthrown. But he was one of the first ones to put forth the idea that you could use sex as a weapon, particularly sex ed as a weapon to sexualize the young people and destabilize the society. Around that same time, 1920, early 1920s, 1920 itself, Antonio Gramsci, I should say, who was an Italian, put forward the idea that you could use the same kind of thing. You could use different things to destabilize society, and he had the term the long march through the institutions. Take over the institutions of a society, and then you could, through cultural Marxism, you could change the society, rather than just trying to take a frontal approach and take over the society, through power. So between Lukács and Gramsci, the idea of cultural Marxism basically came about. And again, sex and sex ed were major weapons that, especially Lukács, put forward as being important. Fast forward a bit to the mid-1930s, and there was a gentleman named Wilhelm Reich, and he's a German. Again, all these people have in common that they're communist. Communism is their philosophy. He was a German communist, and he and several others of this school they called the Frankfurt School, and called it that after it had been initially called the Socialist School, because the name didn't resonate very well with a lot of people. But the Frankfurt School, he and they ended up leaving Germany because it was becoming Nazi Germany, and they were being threatened with death. Coming to the United States, coming to Columbia University particularly, and bringing their ideas with them. He's a gentleman that wrote the original book called The Sexual Revolution eventually. But originally it was called Sexuality and the Culture War. That's what it originally was called before it was interpreted into English. And it was the subtitle was along the lines of for forming the modern socialist person. So again, those type of things should be taken note of as far as the intention of these people that we're talking about. He ended up being put in prison eventually and dying in prison, but his ideas lived on after him into the 50s and 60s, as we talked about at the beginning. He's for instance, he's the gentleman that came up with the term sex positive. So it's all the way back into the 1930s that came up. Then the next one on the list would be Alfred Kinsey, and a lot of people know about Alfred Kinsey, and again, American product, but also somebody who wanted to tear down the Judeo-Christian basis of our society. He was at Indiana University in the 1930s. In 1938, he created a marriage class. They call it a marriage class because they wanted to be accepted, and it was. They became a very popular class, but really it was about sexuality, and it really is about sexualizing young people. And again, in his research, which he used eventually to write two like seminal books for this whole subject. Sexual Behavior in the Human Male was the early one, 1948, and the second one on females, same title except female, was 1953. The research subject that they used were people that were in prison and homosexual folks, and of course he's famous for experimenting on little kids and down to even babies, infants, as far as how many orgasms they could have, at what age they could have them, and that type of thing. And which again would qualify for child abuse, I believe, these days. But he tried to establish the idea that people and children particularly are sexual from birth. That's a very famous phrase of his. And also another word that he coined was socio-sexuality, which means how inclined you are to casual sex. So again, he promoted sexuality amongst his staff. They pretty much had open relationships. His wife was having sex with one of the other graduate student to begin with, and then one of the other professors. And so he was homosexual himself, Alfred Kinsey. And even with all of that, even with the tainted, not representative subject pool for his research, the American universities, which again, starting in the late 1890s, there had been the progressive movement really getting into the universities, land grant institutions and all that came about. And so kind of this communist movement that we're talking about, these communist folks coming in from outside the country, combined with this progressive situation they had going on, and then people like Kinsey, and ended up coming out with supposedly authoritative textbooks that were the basis of what we use today for, in most cases, they use for sex ed. And so again, you can kind of see how corrupt it was kind of from the beginning, and that had political motivations from the very beginning. One more man I will add to this list, a man named John Money. He goes up into the 1960s when kind of this kind of all coalesced and really started changing things in society. But he's famous for, there was a pair of twin brothers from Canada called the Reimer twins that had an unfortunate accident when they were being circumcised. They were trying the newfangled approach to it with an electric type of a machine, I guess you'd say, or instrument to do the circumcision with, and it malfunctioned, and one of the boys' penises was burned. It's literally burned off. And so the parents were, and this is again the early to mid 1960s, the parents were at a loss to what to do with the twin boys, and one of them without normal male anatomy. So they got in contact with this John Money, and he said to them, "I have the absolute solution." And he said, it isn't biological what a person becomes as they mature from a baby to a child and into adulthood. It's how they're raised. And so, it's socially constructed, and we hear sex is socially constructed. And he's the one that created the term gender. So that's where that came from. And also gender identity and then sexual orientation. He came up with those terms. So what he proposed to the parents was to raise the little boy that had this unfortunate accident as a girl, and then the other one had normally as a boy. And it was a kind of the perfect experimental situation for him, because he had two identical twin boys, and one, one's in one situation, one's in the other, and he could prove his social construction of sex and gender theory, which was again had become and still is today, as far as higher education goes, probably the predominant belief on how sexuality occurs. He had a chance to raise him, and they started calling him a her, and gave her a girl's name. I think it was Brian or something like that to begin with, and they changed it to Brenda. Put him in dresses and gave him hormones, gave him female hormones and that type of thing, and did everything they could to make this little boy who grew up with this think that he was a girl, even to the point of having his twin brother, and he, as they matured, encouraging him to have like practice sex sessions and that type of thing, kind of imitated sex sessions, which again is, along with Kinsey's practices, extremely just bad and just wrong, and really probably criminal these days. So he wasn't taking the boy that was supposed to be Brenda, about 12 years old, started tearing his clothes off, his skirt off, and wanted to wear pants and wanted to do all the things that boys do, play with boy toys and that type of thing. But John Money hid that from the public. He said that everything was going well, and he was becoming a she and that type of thing. So again, this is kind of what today's gender, the transgender situation goes back to. Eventually, in their 20s, I think it was late 20s, maybe early 30s, the twin that didn't have the surgical problem committed suicide, first, I think, by an overdose, and then the one that did have, that was made to, but by the way, by the time he was about 17 or 18, he had come out and said, "I'm not going to live like a girl. I'm not a girl," and so he went over to all the different things of the boys, male clothes, and ended up marrying somebody as well, and so it looked like he was going to have a successful life, but the damage, I think, had been done earlier in their lives. So both of them ended up dead in their early 30s. The boy that had the sex change against his will, when he didn't even know what was going on. He ended up committing suicide by gun, I believe, using a weapon. And again, John Money, he's the one that came up with the, along with sexual orientation and gender identity, he came up with the term sexual reassignment surgery. And so that's, again, where that comes all the way back in the 1960s. So with all of those people that I named off as kind of the progenitors of sex ed, it's no wonder that sex ed has become what it has, with a sexualizing approach and really a corrupting approach to the young people that are in school. Now, along with this, there are a lot of other things societally that contributed to a sexualizing environment. In 1960, the hormonal birth control pill was invented. So again, that took a lot of the restraints off of sexual activity in especially the young people. In 1962, the Supreme Court removed prayer from schools, which again, they're putting sexualizing sex ed into schools, and they're taking these things out. So in 1962, the prayer was removed. 1963, the Bible was removed, the ability to read the Bible in class and in the school. SECUS, which is the acronym for the main sex ed program. It's Sex Information and Education Council of the United States. That's what SECUS stands for. It moved into the schools in 1964. So after the other things I mentioned, the Bible and prayer being taken out. And then in 1970, no-fault divorce came about in the United States. And so, again, we were moving more and more away from traditional courtship, traditional marriage, traditional family, and making it easy to get divorced. And then finally in 73, the one that we all are very familiar with, Roe versus Wade, made abortion legal across the country. So to sum things up, really the sex ed that was changed from what it originally had been in the 1900s to 1900 or so to 1950, with the hygiene approach and the ethics and morals being taught, and the bad consequences of extramarital sex being taught. It had changed over by, as we went into the 70s, it's gradually just on to this, from the 70s on up to today, it has become, I think, a really destructive force in many cases, especially the idea of, going along with Kinsey's idea that kids are sexual from birth. That's just crazy. As a scientist, I can tell you that the hormone structure of children, it is anywhere near being ready to deal with sexuality. That they aren't sexual beings at that age. And again, we could go all the way through the changes as children go through and into puberty and past puberty and all that. But it's really, really a crazy and destructive concept. So what I would propose, and I'm going to stop here in a minute and get your thoughts, but what I would propose is that we, because of the way it is, because of high-speed internet pornography and the way that porn has become so ubiquitous, and porn addiction is extremely common these days. And there's reasons we can go into on that in a minute if you like. But because of the fact that porn ends up being the main sex educator for these young people, if we just leave everything alone, particularly at the upper grades like the sophomore, junior, or senior in high school, I think something has to be done in this area. And sex is such a powerful reinforcer. It is the most powerful natural reinforcer, and the most powerful natural reward that humans experience. So it's a powerful weapon, and these guys were right. It's a powerful weapon in their hands to degrade young people with. But I believe that there's a way to educate them where they need to be educated, and do it in a way that leads to what I would call sexual integrity education. I think there needs to be sexual integrity education as a replacement for the sex ed. And just one other thing that I want to get your thoughts, if you don't mind. It's a scary thought, but 53% of boys and 37% of girls believe that porn realistically portrays sex. So there's a large number of them that think that porn is a realistic portrayal of sex. So I believe that we have to speak into that, and we have to speak truth into it, and science and the scientific truth. But I don't think we can stand idly by. But I think we need to recognize the history of this and realize that it has been used for nefarious purposes. And we have to, I guess you'd say, redeem it to some degree and get it going on the right track, and be able to be helpful to these kids to have a good life and not be destructive to their lives. I'll let you, what do you have any thoughts or comments?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for just laying out this really excellent executive summary of the history of sex ed. And it's interesting to see the roots from communist countries and these countries in the early part of the 1900s, and how this has reflected things that we've gone through later on in that century, and things that we're even going through today are still. It's interesting to think that things that we're going through today started with these seeds or these previous programs or these previous people and ideas, whether they're in the U.S. or in Russia or in Germany or in Hungary. It's really interesting. Yeah, and it's also interesting to see what happened to their societies and these countries, because we're not all on the same timeline. We're on different portions, and we might be able to get a glimpse of what happened to their history to understand and be better educated on how to, respond to our own timeline in our country. It sounds like that's what you're trying to point at, perhaps.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, we could definitely benefit from their experience and from knowing about them, and also to understand their motivations. Because our motivations are 180 degrees different than theirs is, because we want to desexualize. We want to save sex with these young people where it should be saved for, which is their marriage and the successful life they can have in building their lives around a family, and all of the things that many of us that have experienced it know are some of the most rewarding things in life. So yes, it's a matter of taking the science on it and the knowledge and putting it in front of these young people in a way that will encourage them to practice chastity, for one thing, coming up to marriage, and practice chivalry on the part of the young men, and again, just respectful relationships really between each other, and the exciting and just no other way to put it, romantic adventure really that courtship should be between a young man and a young woman. I mean, it's just, there's nothing quite like that feeling of being in love, and just all of it, the nerves, the exhilaration, the infatuation, and without the sexuality, without the sexuality to the point particularly of orgasm that is so common today with alcohol culture.
So I've got a bunch of questions, or a couple of questions to ask you. Well, I like to start off with,
Sure.
when it comes to the word gender, how would you say it's defined, or how would you define that word gender, and how would you compare it to other words that we might consider, such as someone's biological sex, and how does that compare to the word gender? What are your thoughts on that word?
I think that gender, as it's commonly used in our society, is not a helpful word in a lot of ways. I think it confuses and muddies the water with a lot of young people. Scientifically, I think that they need to be taught that between 96 and 97%, so that's leaves about 3 to 4% of people that aren't, but not about between 96 and 97% of people by self-report are heterosexual. And so we're talking about the large majority, well, super majority of the population is heterosexual, and their biological sex is absolutely dictating their how they feel and how they identify with themselves. There's only the 3 to 4% that where there's a question otherwise. So I would like to have young people realize what a large percentage of them, there's no question about it. The physical process carries out, creates them into and probably our opinion, our way of looking at it, God's process clearly makes them a young man and a young woman by the time they're 20 years old. The other 3 to 4%, there seems to be processes that go on where they end up with same-sex desires, and then also in some cases transgender, a transgender approach, or dysphoria, I guess you'd say. That's a tiny percentage though of the overall, even of the 3 to 4%, the transgender population, as far as actual scientifically proven actual physical situation of them having those thoughts, having maybe feel like a female but having male genitalia, and vice versa. Tiny percentages scientifically have actually shown that to be the case before the kind of social contagion of transgenderism has struck. Now, those numbers are something along the lines of 1 in 10,000 live births end up having situation where they feel like they're male genitalia, but they feel like a female. So again, female prototype is the way we all start off in the womb before about 8 weeks of gestation. Then if there's an XY chromosome baby, then the testes of that little boy start putting out testosterone, and it organizes. It is help creating the genitalia area and that type of thing. And in the early stages of the pregnancy, the first trimester. And as the pregnancy goes on, almost always, because again, it's a 1 in 10,000 where it doesn't work this way. The brain in the later parts, the second and third trimester, the brain is organized as a male organized brain. And so the baby is born, and it's a boy by his genitalia, and it's a boy in his brain. But 1 in 10,000 times, there seems to be an anomaly, an aberration in the process, where for whatever reason that hormone exposure isn't the same at the end of the pregnancy as it was at the beginning. So you come out with male genitalia and female thinking and feeling brain. The other possibility, female that feels like, somebody who has female genitalia and after they're born feels like they have a male brain, that's even more rare. It's 1 in 30,000. So just on the average between the two, you got to have a 1 in 20,000 chance of having actual physical situation that develops where you have dysphoria, true dysphoria. If you're born into one body and you feel like your brain feels like the other sex. So in answering your question, I think keeping just sex, keeping the two sexes as the predominant approach and the predominant explanation of how almost all of human sexuality works, I think that's the way to do it. And then I think where there's individual variation, as in all the other varieties other than heterosexuality, I think they need to be explained on a case-by-case basis. But to take the whole society, as we've been doing, and kind of wrapping all of the, or much, or most maybe of all the attention on the 3 to 4% that are not heterosexual, and leaving all of the 97%, 96 to 97% of the heterosexuals to just kind of fend for themselves and figure out how to live life on their own, I think is a really, really bad approach. So mostly I would say just focus on sex, because almost everybody, that's all you have to worry about is, are they a male or are they female? And again, for the small percentage that don't fit into that category, then I think, again, more of a case-by-case basis, and approach it as the need arises.
So, yeah, if we have 3% that are considered in that dysphoria section or grouping, but biologically maybe it's 1 out of 10,000, that seems to reflect a huge impact that our society has been pushing this mental confusion onto. It seems like about 99% wouldn't have arrived in this space without being pushed. Only 1 out of 10,000 may have arrived in this space under a different set of circumstances, perhaps.
Yeah, that's that's what I would say is happening in most cases, is the social contagion with the big numbers, of especially we kind of need to separate, Jacob, out a little bit. The 3 to 4% again is all of it, LGBTQ and anything else that they classify under there. So the T part of that LGBT is a tiny part of the 3%. So the dysphoria really is a tiny number in reality. But with the way things are, where we have in some high schools maybe 10 students that think that they're transgender, the odds of that happening in reality, physical reality, they're really, really tiny. So what you just said is accurate. It's social contagion in most cases. The thing is that some of them, a tiny percentage of those young people are actually going to be dysphoric, So I guess the point I'm making is that the tiniest of numbers is the ones that are actually dysphoric as far as transgender. But again, you have your 3-ish% that are not transgender dysphoric, but they are LGBT or LGB, I guess it would be. So lesbian, gays, and bisexuals. So there's a tinier, that's a small percentage, and it's a tiny percentage of actual transgenders, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can you speak to brain development? So like when at a gay pride parade, there could be a child, or at these cultural pushes. Like I saw a clip recently of Elmo from Sesame Street talking about gay pride. I saw a video of a gay pride parade, and there was children. Like one person was carrying a baby and in a backpack. Another person, another one's like a small child holding the hand of someone. So, and then when it comes to like middle school, 12-year-olds being promoted to take hormone blocks or hormone ads, or lining them up for surgeries, series of surgeries. Can you talk about brain development, and when it comes to the youth, all the way down to the youngest of ages, when it comes to influence, all the way through until the brain is fully developed, and what it looks like for a 12-year-old to be presented with this information compared to maybe someone who's 26 or 21, 21 meaning almost fully developed when it comes to brain development, or, near the final stages, I'm assuming. And then maybe 26 could be considered to be, arriving at a fully developed brain for some people.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the brain doesn't fully develop, particularly on males, until 25 or so. I mean, there's arguments that it's not until about 30 that it fully develops on some males, and that's because the males develop slower overall than the females do on average anyway, all the way through, both physically and I guess you say mentally. So they generally end up being taller and bigger as well. So there's a reason for that as far as the development pattern goes. And we're not the only species that happens in. There are lots of other species where the males develop slower and bigger and stronger than the females do. We end up with about 80% more, we meaning males, end up with about 80% more muscle fiber in the upper body, and about 50% more in the lower body. So there's a big difference usually in athletic ability, and that's why you see a lot of the things that we're seeing now. But basically the brain, it's got two growth spurts really, from birth until about the age 5 or 6, and during that time period, there's going to be way over the number of neurons, billions of extra neurons in play, and then what happens is the ones that get used, and there's learning that goes along with them. They're exposed to different things. They're kept, and the other ones are pruned. And so early child life exposure to different things is extremely important as far as how they develop. There's literally windows of development that if you don't hit them, if there are the right inputs during that time period, then that particular skill or that particular ability can't develop. Like even for instance, like sight and sound, hearing language and speaking language and seeing things. If they're certain, they've done experiments where they've kept them in dark rooms, when they're going through this, and they don't see normally, and so they are not able to see, and in cases hear things normally going for the rest of their life. Then the other big growth spurt of the brain is from adolescence, let's say 14, 15 to about 22, 23. And same thing, life experience makes them prune certain areas of the brain and create some synaptic connections and not create other synaptic connections. The really synaptic connections are what we call learning. And eventually that becomes us as our worldview and our personality, who we are. There's a fair element of personality that's heritable, that we get from our parents, but then the rest of it is, again, our experiences. So to your point about adolescent, particularly young child, 10, 12-year-old and through adolescent exposure to different stimuli, they're most vulnerable to addictions at that age, to those younger ages. If they get into addictive substances or behaviors, they'll be most prone to get a lifelong addiction to them. They don't have much of a prefrontal cortex because, and what that is again the judgment and discipline part of the brain. And again, the brain, it matures from back and lower to front and higher. And so the front and higher is where the prefrontal cortex is. It's the last part of the brain to mature. And also in the prefrontal cortex is this very important neurotransmitter called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. It's the main neurotransmitter hormone in the brain that gives humans the ability to put brakes on certain behaviors and to have discipline and executive function and planning and that type of thing. So these kids that you're talking about, these, let's say 10, 12, 15, 16, 17, they don't have much of a prefrontal cortex because it has not matured yet, which is a problem because it's like in class, I always told my college students that when you were younger in high school, if you were a car, you had plenty of gas pedal and no brake because of the prefrontal cortex. But there's the whole other element to it is the GABA system, gamma-aminobutyric acid again, that is the main inhibitory system, neurotransmitter system in the brain. It doesn't come online until the rest of the prefrontal cortex matures. So there's a double reason that little kids and then on up into adolescence really need to be protected from things that would corrupt their thinking pattern and would get them going in the wrong direction because they're so vulnerable to it at that age. And that's why porn, for one thing, is really, really destructive and really can have a lifetime negative effect if kids are exposed to porn and if they get addicted to it. The addiction of porn and food, for that matter, highly palatable food with young kids like that, has an effect on them that's, believe it or not, a population level, probably more destructive than some of the hard drugs we think about, because heroin, meth, just take alcohol, throw all of the drugs we think of as being the big addictive drugs. They only end up addicting about 10% of the population that try them because they're unnatural. They have hijacked the reward system in the brain, which, again, the reward system, I should add that, the reward system in those young kids and up through adolescence is probably the strongest time for the reward system of all. And testosterone in boys hits its peak at age 17. So, but only about 10% that try any of the classic addictive drugs get addicted to them. On the other hand, with highly palatable food, and especially porn with boys, we're looking at 40 to 80% of the population that try it that end up getting addicted to it because it has a natural satiation override to it, a binging element to it, where with another unnatural reward, we have these built-in brain capacities to shut it down because it's unnatural. With sex and food, which are our natural drives, we don't have that same shutdown mechanism in the brain. And so That's why we end up with so many, especially boys. Boys have about 6 times the chance of being addicted to porn than the girls do. And then with food addiction, so many of the girls end up with that. I always talk to my students again about, you can tell a lot by just looking at different societal institutions. The eating disorder clinics have about 90% of females that are showing up to those. And the sex addiction clinics have about 90% of males that are showing up to those for help. So we really have to be careful what our young people are exposed to, because they're so vulnerable at that time of their life because of the brain qualities that we've been discussing. And that's a great question that every parent should know about, as far as the importance of trying to protect your young people from the exposure to these things, because they have such a potential for addiction and destruction.
Wow. Thank you for really diving in deep on that. That's really helpful to know as a parent, and I can imagine pregnancy clinic directors will benefit from understanding that as they're leading parenting classes and having connections or influence over local school boards or school educational decisions. So I think we've got about 3 more minutes for this podcast, and I'd like to ask you to maybe cast a vision for what you would see as desired for this sexual integrity education shift from the traditional sex education that's been used as a weapon in some ways against Christianity or people with faith.
Yeah, that's a great question, and a great goal to aspire to. I would like to see, again, it be segregated to the upper grades. First of all, I think that, again, Kinsey's idea of that we're sexual from birth, I think, is a extremely destructive idea. So I think the younger ages should be, especially like up through 5th, 6th grade, up into where you start getting to middle school, left alone. Let them be, have their innocence. Let them be little kids as they want to be, and that matches up with their hormones in their brains. Middle school issues start arising, and I think that at that point, I think that the basic things along the lines of differences between males and females and that type of thing, I think, need to be brought out. Again, going into the upper years of high school, I think that what I mentioned earlier, the anatomy and the physiology and the biochemical structure of all of it needs to be explained to them. But along with that, relationships, how to create healthy relationships, how to, as a young man, treat a young woman with respect, what chivalry means, and on the part of both of them, but particularly the young woman, modesty, and what her, the sight of her in certain ways that she portrays herself, how that can affect the boys having the huge amount of testosterone they have at the time and very little prefrontal cortex and GABA system in their brain to stop them from having impulsive thoughts and that type of thing. So I think that that education needs to be put in. They also need to realize that leading towards a successful marriage, sexual integrity is so important, because it's really what drives everything, and particularly the young man towards, making the effort to court a young woman, having the drive to actually commit at maybe an earlier age, which historically, again, our ancestors have gotten married more around age 20, especially on the male side of things, and then even down into the teenage years for the female side of things, on average, looking back in our history. And there's a reason for that physiologically, because females' peak fertility is between age 19 and 29. Males is 24 to 26. So having babies being married, first of all, having babies in their 20s, especially their early 20s, is extremely beneficial. Even, a woman who has a baby closer to age 20, her first one, and compared to one that has the baby, their first one at 30, has half the chance of getting breast cancer in your lifetime as the older birthing woman has. So the patterns from the past, I think, have a lot of wisdom for us. And I think helping our young people to get on the pathway of, again, chaste relationships, positive regard for the opposite sex, not only that, but just respect and actual admiration, because again, both sexes we need each other, and both of the sexes do amazing things, are able to do amazing things in this whole process. So educating with sexual integrity education, educating toward those marriage outcomes, I believe is the important thing, because again, marriage has a huge benefit to the individuals, as a couple, then as their children are born, and then their town, their state, their country, and the world, basically. So marriage is really underrated, undervalued. But teaching sex education, sexual integrity education, which is what I'd like to see it change into, with the purposes of promoting great marriages and great families. I think that is something that's sorely needed in this country and really around the world.
Our sponsors include Heritage House, Patriot Insurance, and iRapture.com.
The ProLife Team Podcast is a ministry of iRapture.com.
If you would like to explore making a donation or becoming a sponsor, or have a recommendation for who would be a good guest on the podcast, please contact us at hello@prolife.team.
Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green. He leads me by quiet